Chapter 3 The Rose Beetle Man. In the morning when I woke, the bedroom shutters were luminous and barred with gold from the rising sun. The morning air was full of the scent of charcoal from the kitchen fire, full of eager cock crows, the distant yap of dogs, and the unsteady, melancholy tune of the goat bells as the flocks were driven out to pasture. We ate breakfast out in the garden under the small tangerine trees. The sky was fresh and shining, not yet the fierce blue of noon, but a clear milky opal. The flowers were half asleep, roses dew-crumpled, marigolds still tightly shut. Breakfast was, on the whole, a leisurely and silent meal, for no member of the family was very talkative at that hour. By the end of the meal, the influence of the coffee, toast and eggs made itself felt, and we started to revive, to tell each other what we intended to do, why we intended to do it, and then argue earnestly as to whether each had made a wise decision. I never joined in these discussions, for I knew perfectly well what I intended to do, and would concentrate on finishing my food as rapidly as possible. "Must you gulp and slush your food like that?" Larry would inquire in a pained voice, delicately picking his teeth with a matchstick. "Eat it slowly, dear," Mother would murmur. "There's no hurry." No hurry, with Roger waiting at the garden gate, an alert black shape watching for me with eager brown eyes. No hurry, with the first sleepy cicadas starting to fiddle experimentally among the olives. No hurry, with the island waiting, morning cool, bright as a star, to be explored. I could hardly expect the family to understand this point of view, however, so I would slow down until I felt that their attention had been attracted elsewhere, and then stuff my mouth again. Finishing at last, I would slip from the table and saunter towards the gate, where Roger sat gazing at me with a questioning air. Together we would peer through the wrought iron gates into the olive groves beyond. I would suggest to Roger that perhaps it wasn't worth going out today. He would wag his stump in hasty denial, and his nose would butt at my hand. "No," I would say, "I really don't think we ought to go out." It looked as though it was going to rain, and I would peer up into the clear burnished sky with a worried expression. Roger, ears cocked, would peer into the sky too, and then look at me imploringly. "Anyway," I would go on, "if it didn't look like rain now, it was almost certain to rain later, and so it would be much safer just to sit in the garden with a book." Roger, in desperation, would place a large black paw on the gate and then look at me, lifting one side of his upper lip, displaying his white teeth in a lopsided, ingratiating grin, his stump working itself into a blur of excitement. This was his trump card, for he knew I could never resist this ridiculous grin. So I would stop teasing him, fetch my matchboxes and my butterfly net. The garden gate would creak open and clang shut, and Roger would be off through the olive grove swiftly as a cloud shadow, his deep bark welcoming the new day. In those early days of exploration, Roger was my constant companion. Together we ventured further and further afield, discovering quiet, remote olive groves which had to be investigated and remembered, working our way through a maze of blackbird-haunted myrtles, venturing into narrow valleys where the cypress trees cast a cloak of mysterious inky shadow. He was the perfect companion for an adventure, affectionate without exuberance, brave without being belligerent, intelligent, and full of good-humoured tolerance for my eccentricities. If I slipped when climbing a dew-shiny bank, Roger appeared suddenly, gave a snort that sounded like suppressed laughter, a quick look over, a rapid lick of commiseration, shook himself, sneezed, and gave me his lopsided grin. If I found something that interested me, an ant's nest, a caterpillar on a leaf, a spider wrapping up a fly in swaddling clothes of silk, Roger sat down and waited until I finished examining it. If he thought I was taking too long, he shifted nearer, gave a gentle whiny yawn, and then sighed deeply and started to wag his tail. If the matter was of no great importance, we would move on, but if it was something absorbing that had to be pored over, I had only to frown at Roger, and he would realize it was going to be a long job. His ears would droop, his tail slow down and stop, and he would slouch off to the nearest bush and fling himself down in the shade, giving me a martyred look as he did so. During these trips, Roger and I came to know and be known by a great number of people in various parts of the surrounding countryside. There was, for example, a strange, mentally defective youth with a round face as expressionless as a puffball. He was always dressed in tattered shirt, shiny blue serge trousers that were rolled up to the knee, and on his head the elderly remains of a bowler hat without a brim. Whenever he saw us, he came hurrying through the olives, raised his absurd hat politely, and wished us a good day, in a voice as childish and sweet as a flute. He would stand watching us without expression, nodding at any remark I happened to make for 10 minutes or so, and then, raising his hat politely, he would go off through the trees. Then there was the immensely fat and cheerful Agatha, who lived in a tiny tumble-down cottage high up on the hill. She was always sitting outside her house with a spindle of sheep's wool, twining and pulling it into coarse thread. She must have been well over 70, but her hair was still black and lustrous, plaited carefully, and wound round a pair of polished cow's horns, an ornament that some of the older peasant women adopted. As she sat in the sun, like a great black toad with a scarlet headdress draped over the cow's horns, the bobbin of wool would rise and fall, twisting like a top, her fingers busy unravelling and plucking, and her drooping mouth with its hedge of broken and discoloured teeth wide open as she sang, loudly and harshly, but with great vigour. It was from Agatha that I learned some of the most beautiful and haunting of the peasant songs. Sitting on an old tin in the sun, eating grapes or pomegranates from her garden, I would sing with her, and she would break off now and then to correct my pronunciation. We sang, verse by verse, the gay, rousing song of the river, Vangelio, and of how it dropped from the mountains, making the gardens rich, the fields fertile, and the trees heavy with fruit. We sang, rolling our eyes at each other in exaggerated coquetry, the funny little love song called Falsehood. Lies, lies, we warbled, shaking our heads. All lies, but it is my fault for teaching you to go around the countryside, telling people I love you. Then we would strike a mournful note and sing perhaps the low lilting song called Why Are You Leaving Me? We were almost overcome by this one, and we would wail out the long soulful lyrics, our voices quavering. When we came to the last bit, the most heartrending of all, Agatha would clasp her hands to her great breasts, her black eyes would become misty and sad, and her chins would tremble with emotion. As the last discordant notes of our duet faded away, she would turn to me, wiping her nose on the corner of her headdress. What fools we are, eh? What fools, sitting here in the sun singing, and of love too. I am too old for it, and you are too young, and yet we waste our time singing about it. Ah, well, let's have a glass of wine, eh? Apart from Agatha, the person I liked best was the old shepherd, Yanni, a tall, slouching man with a great hooked nose like an eagle and incredible moustaches. I first met him one hot afternoon when Roger and I had spent an exhausting hour trying to dig a large green lizard out of its hole in a stone wall. At length, unsuccessful, sweaty and tired, we had flung ourselves down beneath 5 little cypress trees that cast a neat square of shadow on the sun-bleached grass. Lying there, I heard the gentle, drowsy tinkling of a goat bell, and presently the herds wandered past us, pausing to stare with vacant yellow eyes, bleat sneeringly, and then move on. The soft sound of the bells and of their mouths ripping and tearing at the undergrowth had a soothing effect on me, and by the time they drifted slowly past and the shepherd appeared, I was nearly asleep. He stopped and looked at me, leaning heavily on his brown olive-wood stick, his little black eyes fierce under his shaggy brows, his big boots planted firmly in the heather. "Good afternoon," he greeted me gruffly. "You are the foreigner, the little English lord." By then I was used to the curious peasant idea that all English people were lords, and I admitted that that's who I was. He turned and roared at a goat which had reared onto its hind legs and was tearing at a young olive, and then turned back. "I will tell you something, little lord," he said. "It is dangerous for you to lie here beneath these trees." I glanced up at the cypresses, but they seemed safe enough to me, and so I asked why he thought they were dangerous. "Ah, you may sit under them, yes. They cast a good shadow, cold as well water. But that's the trouble, they tempt you to sleep, and you must never, for any reason, sleep beneath the cypresses." He paused, stroked his moustache, waited for me to ask why, and then went on. "Why? Why? Because if you did, you would be changed when you woke. Yes, the black cypresses, they are dangerous. While you sleep, their roots grow into your brains and steal them, and when you wake up, you are mad, head as empty as a whistle." I asked whether it was only the cypress that could do this, or did it apply to other trees. No, only the cypress, said the old man, peering up fiercely at the trees above me as though to see whether they were listening. Only the cypress is the thief of intelligence, so be warned, little lord, and don't sleep here. He nodded briefly, gave another fierce glance at the dark blades of the cypress as if daring them to make some comment, and then picked his way carefully through the myrtle bushes to where his goats grazed scattered about the hill, their great udders swinging like bagpipes beneath their bellies. I got to know Yanni very well, for I was always meeting him during my explorations, and occasionally I visited him in his little house, where he would ply me with fruit and give me advice and warnings to keep me safe on my walks. Perhaps one of the most weird and fascinating characters I met during my travels was the Rose Beetle Man. He had a fairy tale air about him that was impossible to resist, and I used to look forward eagerly to my infrequent meetings with him. I first saw him on a high, lonely road leading to one of the remote mountain villages. I could hear him long before I could see him, for he was playing a rippling tune on a shepherd's pipe, breaking off now and then to sing a few words in a curious nasal voice. As he rounded the corner, both Roger and I stopped and stared at him in amazement. He had a sharp, fox-like face, with large slanting eyes of such a dark brown that they appeared black. They had a weird, vacant look about them, and a sort of bloom, such as one finds on a plum, a pearly covering, almost like a cataract. He was short and slight, with a thinness about his wrists and neck that argued a lack of food. His dress was fantastic, and on his head was a shapeless hat with a very wide, floppy brim. It had once been bottle green, but was now speckled and smeared with dust, wine stains, and cigarette burns. In the band were stuck a fluttering forest of feathers, cock feathers, hoopoo feathers, owl feathers, the wing of a kingfisher, the claw of a hawk, and a large dirty white feather that may have come from a swan. His shirt was worn and frayed, grey with sweat, and round the neck dangled an enormous cravat of the most startling blue satin. His coat was dark and shapeless, with patches of different hues here and there, on the sleeve a bit of white cloth with a design of rosebuds, on the shoulder a triangular patch of wine red and white spots. The pockets of this garment bulged, the contents almost spilling out. Combs, balloons, little highly coloured pictures of the saints, olive wood carvings of snakes, camels, dogs and horses, cheap mirrors, a riot of handkerchiefs, and long twisted rolls of bread decorated with seeds. His trousers, patched like his coat, drooped over a pair of scarlet charujias, leather shoes with upturned toes decorated with a large black and white pom-pom. This extraordinary character carried on his back bamboo cages full of pigeons and young chickens, several mysterious sacks, and a large bunch of fresh green leeks. With one hand he held his pipe to his mouth, and in the other a number of lengths of cotton, to each of which was tied an almond-size rose beetle, glittering golden green in the sun, all of them flying around his hat, with desperate deep buzzings trying to escape from the thread tied firmly around their waists. Occasionally, tired of circling round and round without success, one of the beetles would settle for a moment on his hat, before launching itself off once more on its endless merry-go-round. When he saw us, the rose beetle man stopped, gave a very exaggerated start, doffed his ridiculous hat, and swept us a low bow. Roger was so overcome by this unlooked-for attention that he let out a volley of surprised barks. The man smiled at us, put on his hat again, raised his hands, and waggled his long bony fingers at me. Amused and rather startled by this apparition, I politely bade him good day. He gave another courtly bow. I asked him if he had been to some fiesta. He nodded his head vigorously, raised his pipe to his lips, and played a little lilting tune on it, pranced a few steps in the dust of the road, and then stopped and jerked his thumb over his shoulder, pointing back the way he had come. He smiled, patted his pockets, and rubbed his forefinger and thumb together in the Greek way of expressing money. I suddenly realized that he must be dumb. So standing in the middle of the road, I carried on a conversation with him, and he replied with a varied and very clever pantomime. I asked him what the rose beetles were for, and why he had them tied with pieces of cotton. He held his hand out to denote small boys, took one of the lengths of cotton from which a beetle hung, and whirled it rapidly around his head. Immediately the insect came to life and started on its planet-like circling of his hat, and he beamed at me. Pointing up at the sky, he stretched his arms out and gave a deep nasal buzzing while he banked and swooped across the road. Aeroplane, any fool could see that. Then he pointed to the beetles, held out his hand to denote children, and whirled his stock of beetles round his head so that they all started to buzz peevishly. Exhausted by his explanation, he sat down by the edge of the road, played a short tune on his flute, breaking off to sing in his curious nasal voice. They were not articulate words he used, but a series of strange gruntings and tenor squeaks that appeared to be formed at the back of his throat and expelled through his nose. He produced them, however, with such verve and such wonderful facial expressions that you were convinced the curious sounds really meant something. Presently, he stuffed his flute into his bulging pocket, gazed at me reflectively for a moment, and then swung a small sack off his shoulder, undid it, and to my delight and astonishment, tumbled 6 tortoises into the dusty road. Their shells had been polished with oil until they shone, and by some means or another he had managed to decorate their front legs with little red bows. Slowly and ponderously they unpacked their heads and legs from their gleaming shells and set off down the road doggedly and without enthusiasm. I watched them fascinated. The one that particularly took my fancy was quite a small one with a shell about the size of a teacup. It seemed more sprightly than the others, and its shell was a paler colour, chestnut, caramel and amber. Its eyes were bright and its walk was alert as any tortoise's could be. I sat contemplating it for a long time. I convinced myself that the family would greet its arrival at the villa with tremendous enthusiasm, even perhaps congratulating me on finding such an elegant specimen. The fact that I had no money on me did not worry me in the slightest, for I would simply tell the man to call at the villa for payment the next day. It never occurred to me that he might not trust me. The fact that I was English was sufficient, for the islanders had a love and a respect for the Englishman out of all proportion to his worth. They would trust an Englishman where they would not trust each other. I asked the rose beetle man the price of the little tortoise. He held up both hands, fingers spread out. However, I hadn't watched the peasant transacting business for nothing. I shook my head firmly and held up 2 fingers, unconsciously imitating the man. He closed his eyes in horror at the thought and held up 9 fingers. I held up 3. He shook his head, and after some thought held up 6 fingers. I, in return, shook my head and held up 5. The rose beetle man shook his head and sighed deeply and sorrowfully, so we sat in silence and stared at the tortoises crawling heavily and uncertainly about the road, with the curious, graceless determination of babies. Presently, the rose beetle man indicated the little tortoise and held up 6 fingers again. I shook my head and held up 5. Roger yawned loudly. He was thoroughly bored by this silent bargaining. The rose beetle man picked up the reptile and showed me in pantomime how smooth and lovely its shell was, how erect its head, how pointed its nails. I remained implacable. He shrugged, handed me the tortoise, and held up 5 fingers. Then I told him I had no money and that he would have to come the next day to the villa, and he nodded as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Excited by owning this new pet, I wanted to get back home as quickly as possible in order to show it to everyone, so I said goodbye, thanked him, and hurried off along the road. When I reached the place where I had to cut down through the olive groves, I stopped and examined my acquisition carefully. He was, undoubtedly, the finest tortoise I had ever seen, and worth, in my opinion, at least twice what I had paid for him. I patted his scaly head with my finger and placed him carefully in my pocket. Before diving down the hillside, I glanced back. The rose beetle man was still in the same place on the road, but he was doing a little jig, prancing and swaying, his flute warbling, while in the road at his feet the tortoises ambled to and fro, dimly and heavily. The new arrival was duly christened Achilles, and turned out to be a most intelligent and lovable beast, possessed of a peculiar sense of humour. At first he was tethered by a leg in the garden, but as he grew tamer, we let him go where he pleased. He learned his name in a very short time, and we only had to call out once or twice and then wait patiently for a while, and he would appear, lumbering along the narrow cobbled paths on tiptoe, his head and neck stretched out eagerly. He loved being fed and would squat regally in the sun while we held out bits of lettuce, dandelions, or grapes for him. He loved grapes as much as Roger did, so there was always a great rivalry. Achilles would sit mumbling the grapes in his mouth, the juice running down his chin, and Roger would lie nearby, watching him with agonized eyes, his mouth drooling saliva. Roger always had his fair share of the fruit, but even so he seemed to think it a waste to give such delicacies to a tortoise. When the feeding was over, if I didn't keep an eye on him, Roger would creep up to Achilles and lick his front vigorously in an attempt to get the grape juice that the reptile had dribbled down himself. Achilles, affronted at such a liberty, would snap at Roger's nose, and then when the licks became too overpowering and moist, he would retreat into his shell with an indignant wheeze and refuse to come out until we'd removed Roger from the scene. But the fruit that Achilles liked best were wild strawberries. He would become positively hysterical at the mere sight of them, lumbering to and fro, craning his head to see if you were going to give him any, gazing at you pleadingly with his tiny boot-button eyes. The very small strawberries he could devour at a gulp, for they were only the size of a fat pea. But if you gave him a big one, say the size of a hazelnut, he behaved in a way that I have never seen another tortoise emulate. He would grab the fruit, and, holding it firmly in his mouth, would stumble off at top speed until he reached a safe and secluded spot among the flower beds, where he would drop the fruit and then eat it at leisure, returning for another one when he'd finished. As well as developing a passion for strawberries, Achilles also developed a passion for human company. Let anyone come into the garden to sit and sunbathe, to read, or for any other reason, and before long there would be a rustling among the sweet williams, and Achilles' wrinkled and earnest face would be poked through. If you were sitting in a chair, he contented himself with getting as close to your feet as possible, and there he would sink into a deep and peaceful sleep, his head drooping out of his shell, his nose resting on the ground. If, however, you were lying on a rug sunbathing, Achilles would be convinced that you were lying on the ground simply in order to provide him with amusement. He would surge down the path and onto the rug with an expression of bemused good humour on his face. He would pause, survey you thoughtfully, and then choose a portion of your anatomy on which to practice mountaineering. Suddenly to have the sharp claws of a determined tortoise embedded in your thigh as he tries to lever himself up onto your stomach is not conducive to relaxation. If you shook him off and moved the rug, it would only give you temporary respite, for Achilles would circle the garden grimly until he found you again. This habit became so tiresome that after many complaints and threats from the family, I had to lock him up whenever we lay in the garden. Then one day the garden gate was left open, and Achilles was nowhere to be found. Search parties were immediately organised, and the family, who up until then had spent most of their time openly making threats against the reptile's life, wandered about the olive groves shouting, "Achilles, strawberries! Achilles! Achilles, strawberries!" At length we found him. Ambling along in his usual detached manner, he had fallen into a disused well, the wall of which had long since disintegrated, and the mouth of which was almost covered by ferns. He was, to our regret, quite dead. Even Leslie's attempts at artificial respiration, and Margot's suggestion of forcing strawberries down his throat to give him, as she explained, something to live for, failed to get any response. So mournfully and solemnly, his corpse was buried in the garden under a small strawberry plant, Mother's suggestion. A short funeral address, written and read in a trembling voice by Larry, made the occasion a memorable one. It was only marred by Roger, who, in spite of all my protests, insisted on wagging his tail throughout the burial service. Not long after Achilles had been taken from us, I obtained another pet from the Rose Beetle man. This time it was a pigeon. He was still very young, and had to be force-fed on bread and milk and soaked corn. He was the most revolting bird to look at, with his feathers pushed through the wrinkled scarlet skin, mixed with the horrible yellow down that covers baby pigeons and makes them look as though they had been peroxiding their hair. Owing to his repulsive and obese appearance, Larry suggested we call him Quasimodo, and, liking the name without realising the implications, I agreed. For a long time after he could feed himself, and when all his feathers had grown, Quasimodo retained a sprig of yellow down on his head, which gave him the appearance of a rather pompous judge, wearing a wig several sizes too small. Owing to his unorthodox upbringing and the fact that he had no parents to teach him about the facts of life, Quasimodo became convinced that he was not a bird at all, and refused to fly. Instead, he walked everywhere. If he wanted to get onto a table or a chair, he stood below it, ducking his head and cooing in a rich contralto until someone lifted him up. He was always eager to join us in anything we did, and would even try to come for walks with us. This, however, we had to stop, for either you carried him on your shoulder, which was risking an accident on your clothes, or else you let him walk behind. And if you let him walk, then you had to slow down your own pace to suit his, for should you get too far ahead, you would hear the most frantic and imploring coos, and turn round to find Quasimodo running desperately after you, his tail wagging seductively, his iridescent chest pouted out with indignation at your cruelty. Quasimodo insisted on sleeping in the house. No amount of coaxing or scolding would get him to inhabit the pigeon loft I had constructed for him. He preferred to sleep on the end of Margot's bed. However, eventually, he was banished to the drawing-room sofa, for if Margot turned over in bed at night, Quasimodo would wake, hobble up the bed, and perch on her face, cooing loudly and lovingly. It was Larry who discovered that Quasimodo was quite a musical pigeon. Not only did he like music, but he actually seemed to recognise two different varieties, the waltz and the military march. For ordinary music, he would waddle as close to the gramophone as possible and sit there with pouting chest, eyes half closed, purring softly to himself. But if the tune was a waltz, he would move round and round the machine, bowing, twisting and cooing tremulously. For a march, on the other hand, salsa, for preference, he drew himself up to his full height, inflated his chest, and stamped up and down the room, while his coo became so rich and throaty that he seemed in danger of strangling himself. He never attempted to perform these actions for any other kind of music, except marches and waltzes. Occasionally, however, if he had not heard any music for some time, he would, in his enthusiasm at hearing the gramophone, do a march for a waltz, or vice versa. But he invariably stopped and corrected himself halfway through. One sad day we found, on waking Quasimodo, that he had duped us all, for there among the cushions lay a glossy white egg. He never quite recovered from this. He became embittered, sullen, and started to peck irritably if you attempted to pick him up. Then he laid another egg, and his nature changed completely. He, or rather she, became wilder and wilder, treating us as though we were her worst enemies, slinking up to the kitchen door for food as though she feared for her life. Not even the gramophone would tempt her back into the house. The last time I saw her, she was sitting in an olive tree, cooing in the most pretentious and coy manner, while further along the branch, a large and very masculine-looking pigeon twisted and cooed in a perfect ecstasy of admiration. For some time, the rose beetle man would turn up at the villa fairly regularly with some new addition to my menagerie, a frog perhaps, or a sparrow with a broken leg. One afternoon, Mother and I, in a fit of extravagant sentimentalism, bought up his entire stock of rose beetles and, when he had left, let them all go in the garden. For days the villa was full of rose beetles, crawling on the beds, lurking in the bathrooms, banging against the lights at night, and falling like emeralds into our laps. The last time I saw the rose beetle man was one evening when I was sitting on a hilltop overlooking the road. He had obviously been to some fiesta and had been plied with much wine, for he swayed to and fro across the road, piping a melancholy tune on his flute. I shouted a greeting, and he waved extravagantly without looking back. As he rounded the corner, he was silhouetted for a moment against the pale lavender evening sky. I could see his battered hat with the fluttering feathers, the bulging pockets of his coat, the bamboo cages full of sleepy pigeons on his back, and above his head, circling drowsily round and round, I could see the dim specks that were the rose beetles. Then he rounded the curve of the road, and there was only the pale sky with a new moon floating in it like a silver feather, and the soft twittering of his flute dying away in the dusk.